little Trump girl crying after leftist principal banned the Pledge of Allegiance, but a WWII veteran rushed in and subscribe to the channel right now to find out the end of this epic story, and comment below which part of this great America you are watching from. That Tuesday morning dawned under a blanket of heavy, leaden clouds, as if the sky above Springfield itself were weeping in anticipation of the injustice about to unfold. At Lincoln High School, the air didn't smell of fresh textbooks or chalk dust, aromas that once defined the sanctuary of American learning. Instead, there was a sterile, almost clinical scent, mingled with the electric tension of an environment where freedom of thought was being systematically asphyxiated. For Jolie, a girl of just 14, walking through the school gates was no longer an act of seeking knowledge, but a daily entry into a silent war zone where her identity, her faith, and her patriotism were the enemies to be neutralized. Known in whispers, sometimes with affection by the few, often with scorn by the indoctrinated majority, as the little MAGA girl, Jolie walked the hallways with her head down, clutching her binders against her chest like a makeshift shield. She was small for her age, with blonde hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders and blue eyes that lately carried a sadness far too mature for a teenager. She wasn't a political activist in the aggressive way television portrayed. She didn't scream, she didn't riot, she didn't vandalize. Jolie was simply a girl raised in a home where love for God and gratitude for America were served at the table alongside dinner, where the star-spangled banner wasn't a rag, but a sacred relic for which good men had breathed their last. The atmosphere at Lincoln High had shifted drastically over the last 2 years, a slow, cancerous metamorphosis that corroded the foundations of traditional values. The walls, once adorned with portraits of the Founding Fathers and copies of the Constitution, now displayed garish posters with slogans of social justice, forced equity, and historical reinterpretations that painted the nation's past as a stain of shame. Mrs. Harrington, the new principal, was the architect of this transformation. A woman with a cold smile and eyes that scanned students for any sign of ideological dissent, Harrington viewed the school not as a place to teach how to think, but as a laboratory to teach what to think. Under her tenure, the curriculum had been purified of any trace of American exceptionalism, replaced by a narrative of guilt and resentment. Jolie felt this oppression in her bones. She watched her peers, kids who used to play and laugh without a care, transform into little censors, vigilantes of language and thought, ready to report anyone who didn't repeat the administration-approved mantras. Jolie's loneliness was palpable. She was an island of tradition in a sea of progressive radicalism. On that specific day, the tension was even higher. Rumors ran through the halls, nervous whispers in the locker rooms and the cafeteria, that Mrs. Harrington was about to implement her most drastic measure yet, the final phase of inclusion, a bureaucratic euphemism for the total eradication of any nationalist symbol within the school perimeter. Jolie paused in front of her locker, her hands trembling slightly as she spun the combination dial. Inside, taped to the metal door, was a small photo of her grandfather, a man with a square jaw and a serene gaze, wearing his navy dress blues. He was gone now, but his teachings remained alive in his granddaughter's heart. "Freedom is fragile, honey," he used to say, his voice raspy like someone who had watched the world burn and be reborn. "It needs to be protected every day, in the little things." It was thinking of him that Jolie pinned with meticulous care the small American flag pin onto the collar of her crisp white blouse. The pin was tiny, almost insignificant to an inattentive observer, but in that hostile environment it was a blinding beacon of resistance. It was her silent way of saying, "I am still here. I still remember who we are." As she closed the locker, she felt the stairs, They were heavy, loaded with judgment. A group of seniors wearing T-shirts with board-approved political slogans walked past her, laughing and pointing. "There goes the cult girl," one of them sneered, loud enough for her to hear. Jolie bit her lower lip, holding back the tears that threatened to well up. She wanted to answer, wanted to explain that loving her country wasn't a cult, that honoring veterans wasn't hate, but she knew it was useless. In that ideological court, she had already been judged and convicted without the right to a defense. The bell rang, a shrill sound that echoed like an air raid siren, signaling the start of the mandatory assembly in the main auditorium. Jolie took a deep breath, trying to calm the erratic beating of her heart, and joined the stream of students marching mechanically toward the great hall. The Lincoln High Auditorium was vast, with a high ceiling and velvet curtains that smelled of mildew and forgotten history. However, the atmosphere inside was far from solemn. It was suffocating. Mrs. Harrington was already on stage, stationed behind the podium like a general inspecting her troops, flanked by teachers who looked more like hostages than educators, all wearing neutral expressions. Terrified of making any move that might attract the principal's wrath, Jolie found a seat at the end of a row in the middle of the hall, trying to make herself as small as possible. She smoothed her navy blue skirt, feeling the cold metal of the pin against her skin through the fabric of her blouse, a physical reminder of her allegiance. As the students settled, the hum of conversation died down, replaced by a tense silence. Everyone knew something different was happening today. Principal Harrington adjusted her thick-rimmed glasses and leaned into the microphone, a predatory smile curving her thin lips. "Good morning, Lincoln students." Her voice reverberated through the speakers, excessively loud, slightly distorted by static. Today marks a new chapter in our journey toward a truly safe and inclusive environment. For too long, we have allowed archaic and exclusionary rituals to divide our community. For too long, we have let symbols of historical oppression be displayed without context, hurting the sensibilities of those marginalized by the system. Jolie felt a chill run down her spine. She knew exactly what the principal was talking about. Words like oppression and exclusion were the codes Harrington used whenever she wanted to destroy something beautiful and traditional. The girl looked around, seeking some sign of disagreement, but saw only apathetic or nodding faces. The indoctrination had been effective. Many of those kids truly believed that patriotism was the problem, that the flag was a symbol of hate, and that erasing history was the only path to progress. Jolie's loneliness deepened, turning into a black hole in the center of her chest. She felt like a foreigner in her own land, an exile within her own school. At the back of the auditorium, almost invisible in the shadows of the last row, was a presence that clashed completely with that scene of juvenile conformity and academic arrogance. An elderly man, sitting with a spine as straight as a rod despite his advanced age, watched the scene with piercing grey eyes, eyes that had seen the worst humanity could produce and yet maintained an unshakable spark of hope. Colonel Abraham, a reluctant guest for History Week, a concession the principal made only to fulfill state curriculum requirements with the intention of deconstructing the myth of war immediately after, looked like a bronze statue come to life. His World War II uniform, preserved immaculately, told a story that no revisionist textbook could erase. The medals on his chest clinked softly with every deep breath he took, containing the indignation growing within him. He saw the blonde girl, the little patriot isolated in the sea of indoctrination, and recognized in her the same fear and the same courage he had seen on the faces of young soldiers before the landing at Normandy. He knew the battle was about to begin, not with firearms, but with words and spirits, and he was ready. Mrs. Harrington continued her speech, her voice rising in pitch, inflamed by her own rhetoric. Therefore, effective this morning, the Pledge of Allegiance is suspended indefinitely. We will no longer force anyone to swear loyalty to a symbol that represents pain for so many." There was some scattered applause, started by the principal's favorite students, but the majority remained silent. For Jolie, those words were like a physical punch. The pledge wasn't just words to her, it was a civic prayer, a moment of connection with something greater, with her grandfather's sacrifice, with the essence of what it meant to be American. The clock on the wall hit 8:00 a.m. It was time. Habit, tradition, and honor spoke louder than fear. While the principal smiled, satisfied with her decree, Jolie felt a strength that didn't come from her muscles, but from her soul. She couldn't stay seated. She couldn't accept the silence. Slowly, with legs trembling like green twigs in the wind, the little MAGA girl stood up. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor was audible in the silence of the auditorium. Heads turned, whispers began. Mrs. Harrington stopped speaking, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the small figure daring to challenge her absolute authority. Jolie was alone, standing in the middle of the auditorium, vulnerable, exposed. Her heart beat so hard it felt like it wanted to leap out of her mouth, but she took a deep breath, closed her eyes to block out the glares of contempt, and in a fluid and solemn motion placed her right hand over her chest, covering her heart and the small flag pin. She was terrified, a child facing an institutional giant, but the flame of truth burned within her. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know the fury that was about to crash down on her head, nor the salvation awaiting in the shadows. She only knew that in that moment of moral darkness, someone needed to light a light, even if it was a small and trembling one. And so, in the hostile silence of Lincoln High, little Jolie prepared to speak, becoming, without knowing it, the epicenter of a battle for the soul of the nation. "I pledge allegiance to the flag." Jolie's voice emerged shaky, a fragile thread of sound challenging the oppressive weight of the silence Principal Harrington had imposed. In the vast auditorium, those first words of the pledge sounded not like a whisper, but like a cannon shot, a shocking dissonance against the symphony of obedience the school had become. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The students around her held their breath, eyes wide, oscillating between shock and fear. Jolie, eyes closed and small hand pressed firmly over her heart, continued, trying to find strength in the sacred syllables she had learned before she could even read. "Of the United States of America." Her voice cracked, choked by the adrenaline flooding her system, but she didn't stop. It was as if an ancestral force kept her standing, an invisible line connecting her to generations of Americans who never bowed before tyranny. On stage, the reaction was immediate and volcanic. Mrs. Harrington's smug smile vanished, replaced by an expression of disbelief that quickly transmuted into visceral fury. To the principal, this wasn't just a student's disobedience, it was a personal affront, a direct challenge to her supreme authority and her ideological crusade to purge the school of any vestige of traditional patriotism. The sharp whine of feedback cut through the air as she grabbed the microphone stand with excessive force, her knuckles turning white. "Stop!" Her scream echoed through the speakers, distorted and shrill, causing several students to flinch instinctively in their seats. "I said stop right now!" But Jolie, driven by an instinct of moral self-preservation she herself barely understood, continued, speaking a little louder to cover the sound of her own fear. "And to the republic for which it stands." Mrs. Harrington didn't stay on the stage. With a brusque movement that knocked the microphone stand over with a metallic clang, she descended the side stairs, her high heels clicking against the wooden floor in a frantic and threatening rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. Every step was a sentence, bringing her closer to the girl who dared to defy the new order. The principal marched down the center aisle like a general on a battlefield, her eyes fixed on the little MAGA girl with a burning contempt. The students in the rows near Jolie began to pull away, sliding in their seats, creating a circle of isolation around the girl, as if her patriotism were a contagious disease from which they needed to protect themselves to avoid being infected or, worse, punished by association. "Are you deaf, girl?" The principal's voice was now free of electronic amplification, but it carried a venom that didn't need loudspeakers to be heard. She reached Jolie's row, invading the girl's personal space with palpable physical aggression. Mrs. Harrington was a tall woman, and she used every inch of her height to loom over the teenager's diminutive figure. Jolie stopped. The words, "One nation under God," died in her throat, suffocated by the knot of terror forming there. She opened her eyes and found herself staring into the mask of hate that was the principal's face. "What do you think you are doing?" hissed Harrington, leaning in so her face was inches from Jolie's. The smell of bitter coffee and cheap perfume was nauseating. "I gave a direct order. The pledge is banned. This is a zone free of toxic nationalism. Who do you think you are to impose your hateful ideology on your peers?" Jolie trembled, her lips quivering as she tried to formulate an answer. Hot tears began to spill over, running down her flushed cheeks. I was just—" she stammered, her voice little more than a broken whisper. "It's my flag, my grandpa." "I don't care about your grandfather," Harrington cut in, her voice rising in volume so everyone in the auditorium could hear the example being made. "And I certainly don't care about that flag you worship like a false idol. Do you understand how offensive your behavior is? Look around you." The principal made a sweeping, theatrical gesture, pointing to the silent and terrified audience. "You are creating a hostile environment. You are emotionally assaulting students who come from cultures that were oppressed by that piece of cloth. Your patriotism is just a pretty word for racism, exclusion, and bigotry." The accusation hit Jolie like a physical slap. Racism, hate. The girl's heart broke. She was raised hearing that the flag represented freedom for everyone, that soldiers fought to free the world from slavery and Nazism. How could that be hate? The mental confusion was as painful as the fear. She felt dizzy, the world spinning around the distorted figure of the principal. The injustice of that narrative was crushing. Jolie wanted to scream that she loved everyone, that she just wanted to honor her country. But the principal's words were like chains, trapping her in a web of lies she didn't have the rhetorical sophistication to dismantle. She was just a child against an adult activist, trained in dialectical manipulation. "Put that hand down," ordered Harrington, her eyes focused on Jolie's right hand, which still defiantly remained over her heart. "Now, take that hand off your chest and apologize to the assembly for your display of imperialist arrogance." Jolie sobbed, a guttural sound of pure anguish. Her entire body shook, but her hand seemed glued to the fabric of her blouse, holding the small pin as if it were the only anchor in a rough sea. She couldn't obey. Her spirit rebelled against the order, even if her body was paralyzed with fear. The silent refusal only inflamed the principal further. "Are you defying me?" Harrington's voice became dangerously low, a predator's growl. "You think that because you're a little blonde American girl, the rules don't apply to you? That is privilege, Jolie. Pure and simple privilege. And I am going to crush it." The principal turned to the other students, transforming the moment into a spectacle of public humiliation. "See, everyone, this is exactly what we are fighting against. This stubborn resistance to progress, this insistence on clinging to symbols that hurt. She thinks she's better than you. She thinks her God and her country are more important than the comfort and emotional safety of our diverse community." Some students, emboldened by the principal's rhetoric, or simply desperate to curry favor and avoid becoming the next targets, began to laugh nervously. Someone in the back shouted, "Sit down, MAGA!" Another muttered, "Fascist." The words were like stones thrown against the glass of Jolie's soul. Every laugh, every insult was confirmation that she was completely alone. The isolation was absolute. The world she knew, where right was right and wrong was wrong, had turned upside down. Here, loving the country was a crime and hating it was a virtue. Mrs. Harrington turned her attention back to Jolie, realizing the girl was on the verge of a total breakdown, but still hadn't physically yielded. The hand remained on the chest. The symbol of resistance remained. The principal needed a total victory. She needed to break the girl's spirit, to send a clear message to any other conservative or patriot who might be hiding in the student body. "That pin?" said Harrington, pointing an accusing finger at the small enamel flag on Jolie's collar. "That is unauthorized political propaganda. It violates the dress code of neutrality I implemented this week. Hand it over." Jolie instinctively covered the pin with her other hand, in a gesture of protection. "No," she whispered, tears flowing freely now, soaking her blouse. "It was my grandpa's. Please, don't make me take it from you, Jolie," threatened the principal, extending an open palm, demanding, relentless. "You have caused enough damage today. You are going to hand me that symbol of hate. You are going to my office, and we are going to discuss your suspension. Maybe, if we're lucky, we can avoid expulsion if you agree to participate in an intensive racial sensitivity and re-education seminar. But first, the pin. Now." The pressure was unbearable. Jolie felt cornered. The figure of Mrs. Harrington seemed to grow, becoming a monster of shadows blocking all light. Institutional authority was being used as a hammer to crush a fly. The girl looked around, her blurry eyes desperately seeking a friendly face, a teacher to intervene, someone to say, "This is wrong." But the teachers looked at the floor, cowering, afraid of losing their pensions or being labeled accomplices. The system was rigged. Justice was dead in that auditorium. "1," counted Harrington, starting a sadistic countdown. "2." Jolie felt her legs give way. She fell back into the hard wooden chair, shrinking, trying to disappear, to become invisible. She sobbed openly, the cry of a lost and desperate child. The humiliation was complete. She had tried to be strong, tried to be like the heroes in the stories her grandfather told, but she was just a 14-year-old girl against the world. The weight of radical ideology was too heavy for her small shoulders. She began to fumble with the clasp of the pin, with trembling, slippery fingers, surrendering to the inevitability of defeat. Mrs. Harrington smiled, a victorious sneer of triumph. She had won. Tradition would be removed, the flag would be confiscated, and the lesson would be learned. The leftist agenda had crushed the patriotic spirit through fear and intimidation. The principal leaned in even closer, reaching out to snatch the pin if the girl took too long. The tension in the air was electric, suffocating, the climax of bureaucratic cruelty. Jolie closed her eyes, waiting for the cold and invasive touch of the principal, praying silently for this all to be just a terrible nightmare. The darkness seemed to have won, extinguishing the last flame of freedom at Lincoln High. Principal Harrington's hand hovered in the air, like the talon of a bird of prey about to capture its helpless catch. It was only inches away from her fingers, touching the fabric of Jolie's blouse and ripping off the small American flag pin, the girl's last vestige of resistance. The auditorium was immersed in a tomb-like silence, a stifling stillness where the only audible sound was the muffled sobbing of the little MAGA girl, who, with head bowed and slumped shoulders, accepted the defeat imposed by the relentless machine of school indoctrination. The narrative seemed concluded. Radical ideology had won, tradition had been humiliated, and fear had established itself as the only law in force at Lincoln High School. Harrington savored the moment, her eyes shining with the sadistic anticipation of displaying the confiscated pin as a war trophy to the Progressive School Board. But then a sound cut through the stagnant air. It wasn't a scream, nor a student protest. It was something rhythmic, heavy, and charged with an ancient authority. Thud, thud, thud. The dry noise of wood striking against the floorboards echoed from the back of the auditorium, reverberating off the acoustic walls with the clarity of a rifle shot. Mrs. Harrington's hand froze mid-air. She blinked, confused, her concentration broken by the unexpected intrusion. Jolie, still huddled, raised her teary eyes slightly, not daring to hope, but feeling a subtle shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. Thud, thud, thud. The sound got louder, closer. Heads began to turn, hundreds of them like a field of sunflowers seeking the sun amidst a storm. In the gloom of the last row, a silhouette rose. It was Colonel Abraham, the old soldier, who up until that moment seemed just a forgotten relic of a barbaric time in the eyes of the school administration, now towered. He leaned heavily on his polished oak cane, but his back straightened with an audible snap of military discipline that defied arthritis and 96 years of life. The light from the ceiling spotlights hit him, and it was then that the auditorium saw what the shadows had hidden, the gold and silver gleam of the medals on his left breast, the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, the Legion of Merit, campaign ribbons from Europe and the Pacific. They shone like constellations of bravery against the immaculate khaki fabric of his World War II dress uniform. "I suggest," Colonel Abraham's voice emerged from the shadows, not as the whisper of an elderly man, but as the low growl of a lion roused from its sleep. It was a raspy voice, textured by decades of smoke, command, and battlefield dust, a voice that didn't ask permission to speak, but demanded to be heard. "That you take your hands off that child before you make the gravest mistake of your miserable life." Mrs. Harrington spun on her heels, eyes wide with outrage. "Who said that? Who dares to interrupt my disciplinary measure?" She searched for the source of the voice, unable to believe anyone would have the audacity to challenge her in that moment of triumph. The colonel began to walk. It wasn't a fast walk. His legs, marked by shrapnel in Bastogne, moved with a painful but inexorable slowness. Thud. Step. Thud. Step. He advanced down the center aisle, and something extraordinary happened. The students instinctively began to shrink in their chairs or pull in their legs to make room, opening a wide path for the veteran, like the waters of the Red Sea parting. There was an aura around him, a gravity that emanated not from bureaucratic titles or academic degrees, but from real experience, from spilled blood and faced death. He was the living embodiment of the history Mrs. Harrington was desperately trying to rewrite and erase. The principal, seeing the old man approach, tried to regain her dominant posture. She adjusted her glasses and crossed her arms, adopting her expression of intellectual superiority. "Mr. Abraham," she said with a condescending tone that barely disguised her nervousness, "you are a guest here, and we thank you for your service, blah, 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 but this is an internal student discipline matter. You have no jurisdiction nor pedagogical competence to interfere. Sit down, please, or I will have to ask security to escort you to the exit." The colonel didn't stop. He kept advancing, his grey eyes fixed on the principal's with a predatory intensity that made her stomach churn. He ignored her order like a tank ignores a bug on the windshield. When he reached the row where Jolie was huddled, he stopped. He looked at the girl, saw the terror in her eyes, the defensive posture, the tears. A wave of protective fury, cold and controlled, flooded the veteran. He turned slowly to face Harrington, placing his frail but honor-armored body between the aggressor and the victim. "Jurisdiction," The colonel repeated the word as if it tasted bad. He struck the tip of his cane on the floor with force, making a whip-crack sound in the silence. "Ma'am, I was landing at Normandy under a hail of German mortars while your grandfather was still in diapers. I saw good men, boys older than these students here, have their lives cut short in seconds so that people like you would have the right to speak freely. But I didn't fight fascism in Europe to come home 80 years later and see a new form of fascism disguised as social justice terrorize an American girl on American soil." A collective gasp swept through the auditorium. The word fascism hit Harrington like a slap. "How dare you!" she screamed, her voice cracking, her face turning red with indignation. "I am a progressive educator. I fight against hate. You are the one representing the oppressive patriarchy, the toxic militarism that—" "Silence!" The colonel's command was so authoritative, so charged with military power, that the principal's mouth snapped shut involuntarily. The conditioned reflex to obey a superior authority, a real authority, overpowered her ideological arrogance. "You talk about hate," Abraham continued, his voice lowering to a dangerously calm tone, pointing a knobby, trembling finger at the principal's face. "But look at what you are doing. You are using your power, your position, to crush a 14-year-old child just because she loves her country. You humiliated her. You isolated her. You made her cry in front of her peers. That is not education, ma'am. That is bullying. That is tyranny. And it is cowardice." He took a step forward, forcing Harrington to physically retreat. The image was powerful, the old warrior advancing, the modern bureaucrat retreating. The visual contrast was stark, the uniform loaded with history against the corporate pantsuit of the new order. "You want her pin?" challenged Abraham, slapping his hand on his own chest, making the medals jingle. "Come take mine. I have a silver star here that I earned dragging my sergeant out of a minefield. Come on, try to rip it off my chest and tell me it's a symbol of hate. Say to my face that my brother's blood is toxic." Mrs. Harrington was paralyzed. She looked around, seeking support, but realized she had lost the room. The teachers looked away, ashamed. The students, who minutes before were laughing at Jolie, now looked at the colonel with open mouths, fascinated by the display of raw courage. The narrative of oppressor versus oppressed that the principal had spent years constructing was crumbling before reality. Here was the true oppressed, a defenseless girl, and the true defender of freedom. The principal realized that any physical move against the veteran would be public relations suicide. If she touched that man, the cell phone cameras, which she now realized were popping up discreetly in students' hands, would record everything. She would be the viral villain. The moral defeat was clear, but Harrington's ideological hatred was deep and resilient. She couldn't win the physical or moral confrontation in that moment, so she resorted to the only weapon left to cowards: bureaucracy and institutional threat. She adjusted her blazer, trying to recover some fragment of dignity, although her hands were visibly shaking. "Very well," she hissed, her voice icy and venomous. "You have turned this into a circus. Congratulations! You appealed to cheap emotion and nationalist theater. But you do not run this school. I do, and the rules still stand." As she looked at Jolie with a gaze that promised future vengeance. "Jolie, get out of this auditorium now. Go to my office, and Mr. Abraham, you will be escorted off campus immediately. I will report this to the school board. I will ensure you are banned from any future district events for inciting disorder and threatening behavior. And as for you, girl, get ready. Suspension is the least of your problems now. I'm opening an administrative file that will stain your permanent record. You will never get into a decent college when I'm done with you." The threat hung in the air, heavy and cruel. The principal knew how to hurt the future, even if she couldn't hurt the present. She spun on her heels and marched out of the auditorium via the side aisle, slamming the door hard as she left, leaving a vacuum of tension behind. The leftist had retreated, but left the promise of using the system to destroy the little MAGA girl's life later, away from public eyes. Colonel Abraham didn't look at the door where the principal exited. His attention returned immediately to Jolie, the tension of the confrontation drained from his face, replaced by a softness that seemed impossible for a man of such rigid appearance. He leaned his cane against the chair and, with visible effort, knelt on one knee, getting down to the eye level of the seated girl. The entire auditorium watched, mesmerized. No one dared make a sound. "Daughter," he said softly, extending a calloused and wrinkled hand. Jolie, still sobbing, looked at him. In the old soldier's eyes she saw no judgment, no pity. She saw recognition. "Look at me. Breathe." Jolie drew in air, trying to control the convulsive crying. She held the veteran's hand. His skin was rough, like ancient parchment, but warm and steady. "You were very brave today," he said, wiping a tear from her face with his thumb. "Braver than many men I served with. Standing up when everyone is sitting, speaking when everyone is silent. That is what defines a patriot. Don't let that woman or anyone else steal that from you. They may have the titles, they may have the rules, they may have the microphones, but they don't have what you have right here." He touched her heart lightly over the pin. "They don't have honor." "But," Jolie whispered, her voice trembling with fear of the future, "she said she's going to expel me, that she's going to ruin my future." "She can try," the colonel said, and a glint of steel returned to his eyes, a determined smile curving his thin lips. "But she forgot one thing, Jolie. We don't leave anyone behind. I fought tyrants much worse than a grumpy school principal, and I am not alone. You think this was the end?" He looked at the auditorium, at the faces of the young people watching. This was just the beginning. Justice takes time. Sometimes she limps like an old man with a cane, but she always arrives. And I will make sure she arrives for you. He stood up with difficulty, groaning softly with the pain in his knees, but refusing help. He extended his hand to Jolie. "Stand up, soldier. Dry those tears. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you broken. Chin up. You are an American." Jolie looked at the outstretched hand. It was an invitation to step out of victimhood and into strength. She grasped Colonel Abraham's hand and stood up. Standing next to him, the difference in height and age was immense, but the spirit was identical. The veteran placed his hand on her shoulder, turning to face the rest of the students. He said nothing to the crowd, just sustained their gaze, silently challenging them to choose which side of history they wanted to be on. The institutional tension still hung in the air. The principal would return, the board would be summoned, the legal battle would begin, but in that moment, on the center stage of real life, fear had been replaced by something much more dangerous to tyranny: hope. The climax had passed, the intervention had been decisive, but the war for the soul of the school and Jolie's future was far from over. The enemy had retreated into the bureaucratic shadows to sharpen their knives, but now the little MAGA girl had a guardian. And a guardian, with the strength of the greatest generation running in his veins, was not something one could ignore. The exit from the Lincoln High Auditorium was not an escape, but a procession. As Jolie and Colonel Abraham walked down the center aisle toward the double doors, a silent but powerful phenomenon began to happen. The barrier of fear, that invisible wall built brick by Mrs. Harrington's administration, began to crack. A student from the football team, a sturdy boy who had spent the whole year with his head down to avoid trouble, stood up. Then a girl from the debate club. One by one, inspired by the sight of that old warrior protecting the innocent youth, the students stood. They said nothing at first, but the gesture was clear. They were rejecting the narrative of shame. As they passed through the doors and entered the main hallway, the sunlight seemed to miraculously begin to break through the layer of grey clouds outside, casting beams of dusty light through the high windows, illuminating the path like a celestial blessing. Mrs. Harrington's threat to destroy Jolie's future, however, still hung like a toxic cloud. In the days that followed, the principal tried to keep her promise of bureaucratic vengeance. She drafted suspension reports, cited obscure conduct codes regarding microaggressions and provocative symbolism, and called an emergency meeting with the school board to formalize the expulsion of the problem student and the banning of the outside agitator. She believed that, away from the spotlights and protected by the rules of the system she manipulated so well, victory would be hers. She counted on the silence of the parents and the apathy of the community. But Mrs. Harrington made a fatal mistake. She underestimated the power of truth when it is lit in the heart of a patriotic community. The video of the confrontation in the auditorium, filmed shakily by dozens of hidden cell phones, didn't disappear. It exploded. It went viral not just among the students, but among the parents, in the town, in the state, and finally, the nation. The images of Colonel Abraham, with his medals and his cane, defending little Jolie against the tyranny of an enraged bureaucrat, struck a deep chord in the American soul. The silent majority, which for so long had endured in silence the radical changes in their children's schools, finally found its voice. What the principal planned as a quiet administrative process transformed into a public trial of her own methods. The school board meeting, scheduled for that Friday night, was supposed to be a quick formality. Instead, it became a historic event. The school parking lot was packed, overflowing with pickup trucks and family SUVs, many proudly displaying the flags the principal had tried to ban. The gymnasium, the location hastily chosen to accommodate the crowd, vibrated with an energy not seen in decades. It wasn't an angry, destructive mob like the ones television often showed in radical protests. It was an assembly of concerned citizens, parents, veterans, and neighbors, united by a common purpose: to restore sanity and protect their children. When Mrs. Harrington entered the gym, accompanied by union lawyers and keeping her nose turned up in disdain, she expected to intimidate the room with her academic vocabulary about equity and deconstruction. But as she took the podium, she met a sea of stern faces, and in the front row, sitting next to Jolie and her parents, was Colonel Abraham. He was no longer wearing his dress uniform, but a simple Sunday suit with the American flag pin shining on his lapel. Jolie, who days before was a weeping, frightened girl, was now sitting with her back straight, holding her mother's hand, her blue eyes clear and focused. The fear had vanished, replaced by the quiet certainty that she wasn't wrong. The principal tried to speak. She used words like systemic safety, historical trauma, and implicit intolerance. She tried to paint Jolie as a provocateur and the colonel as a threat to public order, but her words rang hollow, metallic, disconnected from the palpable reality of the room. When she finished, there was an awkward silence, followed by the sound of the colonel's cane hitting the floor as he stood to speak. The board, pressured by the massive presence of the community, had no choice but to grant him the floor. The colonel didn't use a microphone. His command voice, trained to be heard over the noise of engines and explosions, filled the gymnasium. "We are not here to debate sociological theories that change with the wind," he began, looking directly at the board members. "We are here to talk about what is permanent: honor, duty, country. You were entrusted with the education of your children to this institution, and in return you received indoctrination. You asked for your children to learn to read and write, and they were taught to hate themselves and their history. He pointed to Jolie. That girl committed no crime. The only crime committed in this school was the theft of innocence and patriotism. You tried to cancel the flag, but you forgot that the flag doesn't live on the pole. It lives in the hearts of the people. And you cannot cancel the American people. The ovation that followed was deafening. It was a cry of liberation. The school board members, realizing the political tide had turned irrevocably, acted fast. The motion to suspend Jolie was rejected unanimously. Then, under the relentless pressure of parents demanding accountability, a motion of no confidence in Mrs. Harrington's administration was presented. The principal, pale and trembling, watched her reign of ideological terror crumble in real time. She was removed from her position, effective immediately, her censorship policies revoked, and the inclusion she preached so much was replaced by true freedom. The freedom to express love for one's country without fear of reprisal. The narrative culminated the next morning, a bright and clear Monday, where the sun finally defeated the grey clouds. Lincoln High School was different. The divisive posters had been taken down. The air was lighter, but the most significant change happened in the central courtyard, around the flagpole that had stood empty for months under the former principal's orders. The entire school was gathered outside, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but by choice. Colonel Abraham was there, next to the new interim principal, a man from the community who respected local values. But the colonel wasn't the one who raised the flag. He handed the folded flag, the sacred triangle of blue and stars, to Jolie. "It's your turn, young lady," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "My generation held the torch through the darkness. Now, it's up to you to keep it lit." Jolie took the flag with reverence. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. She clipped the hooks into the grommets with dexterity, helped by the football captain and the student council president, united, without political divisions, just Americans. As she pulled the rope, the flag rose, unfurling majestically against the blue sky, the red and white stripes shining like living fire. The wind caught it, and it snapped up high, a sound of freedom that seemed to heal the wounds of the last few days. Jolie turned to the crowd. She saw her classmates, saw the teachers who now smiled with relief, saw her grandfather in spirit and Colonel Abraham in flesh and blood, rendering a salute with perfect rigidity. She placed her hand over her heart, over the small pin that had almost been stolen from her, but which now shone like a medal of honor. "I pledge allegiance," she began, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the courtyard, and this time she wasn't alone. "To the flag of the United States of America." Hundreds of voices responded in unison, a thunder of patriotism that shook the school windows and resonated throughout the town. There was no irony, no cynicism. There was only the purity of a nation finding itself again through the eyes of a child. The triumph was total. Justice prevailed not by the force of imposition, but by the force of example and moral courage. Jolie, the little MAGA girl, grew up that day. She learned that freedom isn't free and that traditional values aren't weaknesses, but the strongest armor one can wear. Colonel Abraham, watching the flag wave, lowered his hand from his salute and smiled. He knew he could rest now. America was safe, not because of laws or politicians, but because, as long as there were children like Jolie willing to stand up when the world tells them to sit down, the Republic would never perish. Hope had returned to Lincoln High, and with it the eternal promise of liberty and justice for all.